Hello, everybody. Good to see you all here. Welcome to this live stream. It's been a little while since the last one. I think it must be December with the last live stream. So it's really great to be back. Hello to Byron Brand, Stepwise. Hello, June. Hello to everybody else watching out there. Just while people are filing in, it's been a strange all week, hasn't it? It feels like we're in permanent crisis without ever having anything move. You know, for example, in the UK, every day there's a story about how Boris Johnson, with Partygate, having parties during lockdown when they were outlawed across the nation. Oh, he's going to go tomorrow. Another MP comes out saying Boris Johnson has to go. His aides resign. And yet he's still there. It's like this strange kind of everything seems to be so fast, it's moving slowly. Or in Canada, we had all these truckers barricading and blockading, and Justin Trudeau coming out and giving speeches, but nothing seems to have changed very much. They're still locked in that situation. It's this permanent crisis we're all living through. For myself, though, it's been a good week. I've been reading about prayer in early modern Scotland and the experience of prayer, and how Scots during that period understood what prayer was in public worship. And that's actually how I came onto this subject, which we're going to be looking at today, which is kind of feudal relationship, or kinds of feudal relationship, and how they might exist in the modern world. Before we get to that, though, just to mention as well that I've put in the stream title that there'll be a chance to ask me anything. So what I'm proposing is that I'll go through the kind of feudal stuff first, and kind of go into quite a bit of detail about examining that topic. And then at the end of that topic, if then you want to put your questions in the chat regarding the Ask Me Anything, or related to the talk, of course, then we'll come to them then. So don't put them in straight away. Wait till later, and then I'll be able to address them properly. But feel free to put your comments in as we go along, and anything that comes to your mind regarding what we're talking about. So today, I want to look at a specific type of relationship that existed in 15th and 16th century Scotland, and it's one called a bond. Now, I'm fully aware that feudal is a word that's bandied around a lot to characterize a whole range of political and social systems, and it's often used quite inaccurately, and I know medievalists pull their hair out when it's used, but I'm using it just in this case because this relationship, while it could be contested whether or not it's truly feudal, it has many of the hallmarks of it, and to most of us it would look feudal. And the text that really went into detail on the practice of bonding in early modern Scotland was written by a great historian, Jenny Wormald. And you can find, let me see if I can find the exact title of it. 1 second. Kings, Lords and Men in Scotland and Britain, 1300 to 1625. And you can find this text on the Internet Archive for free. You would have to sign up to be a member, but that's free too, and you can take it out, like rent it for 13, 14 days, something like that. So it's readily accessible. Now, what Wormald focuses on in particular is two kinds of bonds in this era, what were called bonds of manrent and bonds of maintenance. And these were formalizations of a relationship between a lord and his man. So a bond of manrent, let's start with that one first. A man, usually a gentleman with his own household or estate, a laird perhaps, or a baron of some kind, would approach a lord, a major significant political figure in the locality. And with a bond of manrent, what they would do is they would essentially pledge their service to this lord. They would pledge their counsel to him, that their willingness to discuss with him various matters and give him advice if he called upon it, defense of him and his property with their life, and moreover, just to be in his retinue, as it were, depending on their level, of course. Now, this pledge would not just apply to the man himself, but to the man's household and all those under him. So they're all kind of in the single figure of this man coming into the service of their Lord. And this is a different relationship than homage. Homage was very similar, swearing fealty or whatever. That could be done to many different people, whereas a bond of manrent was only meant to be given to one lord. So it's a very strong personal relationship, and it's not something which can be inherited. And what I mean by that is the relationship is one where you are pledging yourself to a specific lord, a specific person, even. So it's not the office. So, for example, it's not the office of the Earl of Argyll. It is Colin Campbell, the Earl of Argyll, that you pledge or you make your bond of manrent to. Now, the other way, there is another one. It's not just a one-sided relationship. Often in response or evoking a bond of manrent is a bond of maintenance. And this is where a lord would pledge himself to the man in terms of offering him maintenance, which essentially means protection. So if the man came under attack from another laird or another lord, this lord would come out and bat for him. In conflicts over land and territory, he would arbitrate for him. He would support his side in the issue. And this obligation, again, is to a specific man. It's not something that's inherited. It would have to be renewed if the man died and his son took his place. So this relationship, manrent and maintenance, is a very concrete one. It's between two specific individuals and their households. It was advantageous for a lord during the mid 15th century to do this and onwards because it was a politically uncertain and unstable time. There was a lot of conflict over land and interests, new powers rising. The lords were, in terms of wealth, not much wealthier than many of the gentlemen. So to have these secure, unique loyalty relationships was a good way of securing your power base. It also allowed for control of a large group of competing lords. If we think about the Earl of Argyll, for example, so he would have been in the Western Isles, and he was probably one of the most significant lords in that area. But there was a number of competing families there, so the Campbells of Glenorchy, for example. And Wormald describes these various clans as like snarling dogs. And what she means by that is that without a superior power, they immediately go to war with each other over land. One of the Earls of Argyll, I think the fourth one, he was very indecisive. He was not a very strong lord. And so when he was in charge, many of the clans under him or families were very violent. However, his sons were very decisive. And through this practice of bonds, they were able to maintain control over those under them in a very strong way. They could basically force them to desist. So it was a good way of having a monopoly of violence in a locality, whilst also maintaining peace. For the man, oh, I should say as well, for the lord as well, it's a status thing, right? If you can have many gentlemen pledging bonds of manrent to you, well, that shows your power. And it also increases your power because you can call on them too. It shows your superiority, I suppose. For the man who pledges a bond of manrent, it again offers protection and stability in such a violent context. And at the same time, it offers status too. If you're a young gentleman, you can join this lord's retinue and be in his train. You can be one of his men offering him counsel. There would often be a group of gentlemen following one of these earls or lords. So it was a very prestigious position to be in. It could be forced through extortion. That's an important point to make here. It wasn't just happy clappy. So the sixth Earl of Argyll, Colin Campbell, he had one man who had made a bond of manrent, but decided it was around 1578, I believe. He had decided to break his bond of manrent and no longer be in the service of his lord, of the Earl of Argyll. He went on a bloody rampage against this man. He sent 200 men to his house to burn it down. Every messenger that this man sent for help was kidnapped and brutalized. And within 1 year, the man had repledged himself to Colin Campbell, the Earl of Argyll. So it wasn't like you had a choice necessarily. If you went against the Lord, he would get you back into the fold very quickly. But nevertheless, if you did have one of these bonds, you could count on it being fulfilled. And this was because early modern Scotland was an honour culture, especially in the Highlands and Islands. It was shameful if you didn't uphold your obligations in a bond, and so it was paramount for lords to make sure they protected their men. If they didn't, it would bring disgrace upon them and their family. I guess, we often talk about how there's guilt cultures and shame cultures, and how kind of the Christian West has been a guilt culture, but actually in this context, it's much more a shame culture. Uh, and this would have ramifications too, because it's a kin-based culture, especially in the Gallic lands, where many of these bonds would being made by your families, distant families, or distinct families who have had connections with your families for a long time. So you're bringing dishonor not just to yourself, but to your whole clan. So it was unusual for a lord not to protect his men, and at the same time, it was unusual for a man not to serve his lord as he had obliged. So we can see here, with this strong emphasis on honor, and with in a culture which privileges personal relationships formalized in bonds, that you could have, amidst a very violent and unstable society, pockets of strong stability, pockets of accountability as well. These bonds largely disappear after 1600 in Scotland. And Wormold suggests that the main reason for this was James VI. He wanted to centralize power in Scotland under the state in a number of different ways. My own area of interest is primarily the church in Scotland during this period. And it's true that James undertakes a number of initiatives to establish himself as the de facto head of the church in Scotland, even in earlier than 1600, in the so-called Black Acts. He had, in 1584, I believe, he had essentially declared himself supreme over all matters civil and ecclesiastical. And then in the forthcoming years, he would appoint a number of bishops in the Church of Scotland. And this was not only a bloody nose for the Presbyterians at that time, but the bishops were essentially his instruments within the church. He would have oversight over who was appointed, and they were answerable to him and in implementing his program, which he managed to do mostly well until the Five Articles of Perth. But that maybe is a discussion for another time. But certainly also in more civic matters, he was also interested in centralizing power, ensuring that disputes are dealt with at court, or in courts, I should say, rather than by local nobles or lords. He also went on a systematic campaign of trying to eradicate Gallic culture. And this may be tied in part to his ascension to the English throne. But certainly James and many of the Lowland Scots considered the Gaels, and that would include kind of Western Isles Scots and the Northern Irish, which for those communities, like the Irish Sea was more central to them than maybe mainland Scotland. There was much better waterways, as it were. That was their hub of connectivity. So those cultures were barbaric in their view. They were uncivilized and they needed to be civilized. This was enacted through both military means, various campaigns sent up north to crush various nobles, taking lands for the crowns and their supporters, but also in Ireland you see the plantations in Ulster of Scots being sent over there, but you also have in support of the plantations, various independent plantations. So I think you find in Down and Antrim, these are regions which are not officially planted by the crown, but various Scots or Irish men invite Scots over to those places. And that's why you had an influx of Scottish Presbyterians there, and hence the kind of Presbyterian Ulster Church of today. So these things really saw an end of bonding in early modern Scotland. And indeed, if we look at modern society, there's very little which is like bonding at all. This idea of a very personal relationship of obligations formalized. I think I can think of three places we might find something similar today. One is in marriage, or at least in traditional understanding of marriage, where a man and a woman pledge themselves to each other with obligations. And this is an unbreakable thing. Just like a bond which is in perpetuity, this union or covenant, as it were, is for the rest of life, or at least it was in Christian traditions. This is probably rooted in the idea of covenant that we've already just mentioned, God's covenant with his people. And perhaps that's where the idea of bonding gets its kind of vitality from. Perhaps it's sprung from there. Certainly, early modern Scots considered themselves in a bond with God. And we see this in the practice of prayer, and this is the second area. I think we can still see this sort of feudal relationship, because if you think in baptism, you have essentially been engrafted into God's people, into God's covenant, or God's bond, where God has promised certain things to his people, but at the same time, you are under certain obligations to God, to serve God, to love God, to love your neighbor, to follow others, follow his teaching, etc., etc. And he has promised mercy and grace to you. Well, in prayer, what you see is somebody calling upon that bond or covenant in relation to God, especially in early modern Scotland. The way they would structure their prayers is, we're coming. So I'm sort of paraphrasing how they would think about prayer. We're coming into the presence of God. We're coming before the throne of God, even. So, like coming before your king or your Lord. And first, you confess that you've broken your part of the bond. We are sinners, and we've broken our side of it. And you would be totally right in ignoring this relationship. However, you, Lord, have promised to uphold your side of the bargain for the sake of Jesus Christ and for those of contrite spirit. So there's an argument here. You're using the contract or the bond to persuade God almost, or wrestle with God into a certain position. And then you offer your petitions. Please do X, Y, and Z. And in return, so there's often an oath of amendment, we will serve and love you by the power of your Holy Spirit. And this idea of the bond being central to prayer can be seen in the fact that in the very gestures of prayer. So often people will hold their hands flat against each other, spread out in front of their face or in a kind of upwards motion. And this, in kind of bonding or in the kind of feudal relationship, would be an important gesture in a ceremony where the Lord would put his hands on either side of your hands, and thus you'd be forming the bond. So this gesture implicitly identifies prayer with bonding in some way or another, of mutual obligations between a lord and his man. So the third area where I think we can see bonding or this sort of feudal relationship is, wait for it, the mafia. Now, that might sound like a very strange connection to make and a bit out there, but what I want to do is I have the opening scene from The Godfather here. Great movie. And what I want to do is we'll just play through it, and I'll stop it at various points just to kind of connect it to the feudal relationships. And we'll flesh out to some of the key features of the mafia and how essentially they're much more like a feudal uh, relationship in terms of early modern Scotland than most of modern society is. So, if you could tell me in the chat if you can hear this, I'd greatly appreciate it.
I believe in America. America has made my fortune, and I raised my daughter in the American fashion. I gave her freedom, but I taught her never to dishonor her family. She found a boyfriend, not an Italian. She went to the movies with him. She stayed out late. I didn't protest. 2 months ago, he took her for a drive with another boyfriend. They made her drink whiskey, and then they tried to take advantage of her. She resisted. She kept her honor. So they beat her like an animal. When I went to the hospital, her nose was broken. Her jaw was shattered, held together by wire. She couldn't even weep because of the pain. But I wept. Why did I weep? She was the light of my life. Beautiful girl. Now she will never be beautiful again. Sorry. I went to the police like a good American. These 2 boys were brought to trial. The judge sentenced them to 3 years in prison and suspended the sentence. Suspended the sentence? They went free that very day. I stood in the courtroom like a fool. And those 2 bastards, they smiled at me. Then I said to my wife, for justice, we must go to Don Corleone.
So we can see here already that this man is approaching the Godfather like a man would approach his lord. He has a request, essentially, that the Godfather delivers him justice because he has turned to the police and the judicial system, and it has been unjust. It has not delivered the rightful vengeance against the perpetrators of his daughter's injuries and attack. We'll come on to that a bit later about how the ineffectuality of the state in various ways in administering justice kind of allows room for these sorts of personal relationships or personal obligations. We can see he's petitioning his lord. He's petitioning the Godfather for help. I should also say as well, what a brilliant movie this is. What a great opening to a film. I don't think anything like this would be made today. Just 2 minutes of this man talking It's just brilliant. Just brilliant. So let's carry on.
Why did you go to the police? Why didn't you come to me first?
What do you want of me? Tell me anything, but do what I beg you to do.
What is that? That I cannot do.
I'll give you anything you ask.
We've known each other many years, but this is the first time you ever came to me for counsel, for help. I can't remember the last time that you invited me to your house for a cup of coffee. Even though my wife is godmother to your only child. But let's be frank, you never wanted my friendship. And you were afraid to be in my debt.
I didn't want to get into trouble.
I understand. You found paradise in America. Had a good trade, made a good living. Police protected you, and there were courts of law. But you didn't need a friend like me. But now you come to me and you say, Don Corleone, give me justice. But you don't ask with respect. You don't offer friendship. You don't even think to call me Godfather. Instead, you come into my house on the day my daughter's to be married and you ask me to do murder. Money.
I ask you.
So this is a really interesting objection by Vito Corleone here. So we can see that the man that's approaching him thinks purely in transactional terms. If I offer the Godfather money, he will kill this man for me. It's very American capitalist in a way. That's how he's been living his life, as he says in the Godfather says, in paradise. He's had all he could ever want, and that's just how America kind of is. I pay you, you give me a service, etc., etc. And so he thinks he could do this with the Godfather, who he's ignored for many years. However, what the Godfather points out is this is a very disrespectful way to him to approach him. He doesn't offer respect or friendship. Now, as we'll see, friendship for the Godfather isn't just a kind of being pals, it's a relationship between these two individuals of mutual obligation. It's one where he will pledge himself to the service of the Godfather when the Godfather needs him, and in return, the Godfather will protect him and administer justice for him. What he's basically calling for is a kind of feudal relationship here, and the failure of this man is that he doesn't approach the Godfather in that way. He doesn't try to. He thinks he can just be bought off. When actually, what's needed is not a transactional, abstract one relationship, but a concrete personal loyalty. It should also be pointed out here as well, though, that this scene's really interesting too because it shows that the man coming to the Godfather is doing so of his own volition. He isn't somebody who's been terrorized by the mafia. He's not being threatened with violence against his shop unless he pays the Don so much in cash. He's come here to retrieve the services of the mafia to get them. He's here voluntarily, and this corresponds with what a number of scholars have pointed out, such as Gambetta, the author of the Sicilian Mafia, which you can find on Zed Library. Gambetta points out that while most people in kind of Italian society would acknowledge that the mafia are not a force for good, many of them tolerate or indeed are willing to go to the mafia as a necessary evil. He writes in the first page, the hypothesis developed here is that the mafia is a specific economic enterprise, an industry which produces, promotes, and sells private protection. The mafia represents this industry as it has developed in Sicily over the last 150 years. Examples of the same industry are present in different forms in other parts of southern Italy and in other countries as well. In Sicily itself, the mafia is not only brand name, it grudgingly shares the market with smaller groups which also deal in protection. And if I turn to page 3, find the right bit. In both legal and illegal markets, those who enlist mafiosi to sort out their disputes, to retrieve their stolen property, or to protect their cartels from free riders and competitors, do not perceive that protection as bogus. They may feel dissatisfied because they are forced to pay often for a service they seldom use, as with insurance, or because they pay extortionate prices for it, as they do for other monopoly goods. Still, this practice differs from extortion proper, where the payment aims only to avoid costs directly threatened by the protectors. And even if individuals are forced to pay protection, or to pay a tax to the state, it does not follow that protection, whether by the mafia or the state, will necessarily be useless. The common view conflates coercion and uselessness. This book, by contrast, shows in both theory and practice the difficulties of drawing the line between genuine and phony protection. The reasons mafia services are harmful to the public good are subtler. Now, of course, the author has a rather kind of liberal view on this, but I guess the point is being made that the mafia offers something quite like the feudal lord, protection for his man. And so, if this man genuinely wants protection, he must enter the Godfather's service in some way or another. It's not enough just to pay him. And this is why they have become so established and maintained for a long time. They offer this good through their violence and in tactics of intimidation. We'll notice there as well that in that passage, the mafia protect goods, they protect legal or illegal markets, and they can kind of protect from competitors, but also those who are thieves or taking goods away. Mosca talks about how, in his lecture on the mafia, how there's in that society of Sicily this kind of culture of vengeance, of the blood feud, you might say, like early modern Scotland, where personal conflict should be resolved on a personal basis. It shouldn't be taken to the state. That's an act of cowardice. But what the mafia can do is enact that. They can bring that to fruition for you if you are incapable yourself. So this man comes to the Godfather because he can't protect himself and he can't avenge himself. Whereas in this personal relationship that will be formed by the end of the clip, he can through the Godfather. So let's finish the clip here.
For justice.
That is not justice. Your daughter is still alive.
Let him suffer then, as she suffers. How much shall I pay you?
See, again, he thinks it's just about payment. He doesn't get it yet.
Buonasera. Buonasera. What have I ever done to make you treat me so disrespectfully? If you'd come to me in friendship, then the scum that ruined your daughter would be suffering this very day. And if by chance an honest man like yourself should make enemies, then he would become my enemies. And then they would fear you.
Be my friend. Godfather.
Good. Someday, and that day may never come, I'll call upon you to do a service for me. But until that day, accept this justice as a gift on my daughter's wedding day.
Gracias.
So you can see in the end of that clip that the Godfather only relents, that he only agrees to do justice, not when he's offered payment, but when the man offers respect and his allegiance, his loyalty, and acknowledges him as Godfather. He even bows his head at that point. It's very, you could see if you dress them up in different clothes, if he was dressed as a knight and the Godfather as a king, the scene would still make sense. And that really hits home the point. And then there's the rest. So he doesn't demand any payment from this man. He just holds him under an obligation that one day I may need you to do X, Y, or Z. So there's this perpetual obligations moving forward. That's what friendship means to the Don. And indeed, he says, if somebody's your enemy, he becomes mine. So there's this constant sense of protection between them. I think this idea has been somewhat undermined by more recent media about the mafia, specifically the TV series The Sopranos. If we think about that, for example, the characters in that don't seem to have any sense of friendship with the people that they extort for money. There doesn't seem to be any sense of protection by and large. And there is some sort of honor between the gang themselves. Kind of honor among thieves, I guess is the word. But it never seems to have this kind of lifelong commitment in the same way. And perhaps that's a kind of postmodern critique of this idea, this loyalty. I think of particularly of somebody like Richie Aprile, who the first scene we see him in, he's just out of prison, and he attacks a man and trying to force him to pay him money. It's just the complete opposite of Vito Corleone here. And certainly Tony Soprano is not anything like Vito Corleone in that respect. So just let's think about this in comparison to most of our relationships today with people for a second. So I think the way to characterize this feudal kind of relationship is one between individuals. It's a personal relationship with formal obligations to one another. It's one man to another, and it's concrete. It can't be replicated or kind of abstracted. If one of them dies, that's the end of that relationship, and a new one must be formed with somebody else. By contrast, most of us in our kind of relationships with higher civic powers or whatnot don't have that sort of personal relationship. We are characterized as individuals or atomized individuals who have abstract rights, either given to us by God or they're just part of being a human being in some way. And these rights, right to life, right to freedom of expression, etc., these are kind of obligations upon the state being that which monopolizes violence. And the state's role is to uphold these rights, however long the list is. At the same time, we as individuals or citizens, maybe that's the right word, citizens, have various obligations to the state, i.e., to pay certain taxes, to abide by its rules, and so on. So you can see already that this is an impersonal relationship It is an abstract one between a citizen and his rights and the state. It's not concrete, and this causes, I think, a significant number of problems, not least a lack of accountability. In the feudal relationship that we've just been exploring, it's one man to another, a lord to his man. Both understand who has what obligations in that relationship, and their culture of honor means that if one of them breaks it, the other knows who is accountable for that and can go to other lords and whatnot and hold them to account. It's very clear who's responsible for what. The lord has an obligation to protect you if you serve him. By contrast, in modern Western societies, it's almost impossible to identify an individual who is accountable for upholding your rights. We see this in many domains. For example, I think one of the most obvious is if you mean to complain to a company these days about a product, say it's faulty or you're having trouble with it, no longer can you even get through on the phones. You get put onto the internet or to an automated response, and you have to press various buttons. And it takes about half an hour to actually find somebody to talk to. And when you talk to them, they pass you on to somebody else. And this is because that individual person doesn't have any obligation to you. They only have any relationship to you insofar as their office or job has a relationship to you as a customer. But the individual doesn't have any obligation to you. Once they clock off, they don't owe you anything in relation to that problem. When you turn this to kind of the state, it gets amplified. People pass on problems to others and nothing ever gets done. That's because it's the official, not the individual, who is responsible for X, Y, and Z. And in such large organizations, it's very easy to just never have anybody who's even an office, because it becomes a group of offices, or officials, I should say, who have responsibility. So none of them in particular have responsibility for certain obligations towards you. Perhaps our societies try to get round this through elections. Hear me out, because I know that's a bit of a jump. But in modern kind of democratic elections, most of the time, we're not particularly interested in our local candidates. That's not really the issue. The issue is voting for, certainly in the UK, you vote for the party, but most of the issue is focused on who the leader of the party is. Who are you going to pledge your loyalty to? Boris Johnson or Keir Starmer or somebody else? And so there's this kind of pretend relationship where these individuals become our lord, as it were, who uphold certain obligations to us, and we have obligations to them. But that's just not true. Even if there was some semblance of Boris Johnson being responsible for upholding various rights, he's not responsible as an individual to me. Even if he was, it would only be as Prime Minister of this entire country. But he at least gives a figurehead, I suppose. That's the idea. Same with the President of the United States. We wrestle over this issue of which one should be, I guess, Lord of America, let's say. And there's a big debate over it. But when he's elected, he's only responsible as president, not as Joe Biden. And even then, what precisely is the president meant to do in securing your rights? How does he go about doing that? It's not immediately clear how he upholds his obligations to you in terms of the state's obligations to you. Do you see the issue here? There's an abstract concept of the state which has obligations, but who in the state upholds those, it's not clear because it's officials, and even then, it's kind of spread out amongst the officials. This, in turn, gives people a sense of alienation, a feeling of a lack of power, because they don't have power. They can't hold anybody to account often for the obligations they are owed. It's I think Hannah Arendt spoke about this back in the 60s. I think that's right. Forgive me if I'm wrong on that. In her essays on violence, where she speaks about how in the modern world, the the kind of alienation many young people have, students for example, is not just targeted at one individual or a few rulers. It's against the very notion of bureaucracy. At least it was back then, because in the bureaucratic state, nobody in particular rules. So nobody rules, but we're in a kind of totalitarian non-ruler. So nobody's accountable for it. Whereas if you had an individual relationship, a personal set of relationships, it'd be much easier to have accountability and thus to focus your ire on an individual. I guess even Carlyle mentioned this. He spoke about in his book Past and Present that, you know, some people say, oh, we just need to change such and such a group of people and then the system will be transformed. And he points out, well, tell us who these great people are who rule all these things and we shall do it. But it's an entire system of vagueness, a vague system which avoids genuine accountability through non-personal relationships or impersonal. In turn, this also, and this is probably due to the size of the state, and we'll come on to that more in a second, but it makes it very non-local. You can see in this Godfather scene that these are two men who have known each other for many years in their local neighborhood, who can see each other face to face and have a conversation about their relationship and their responsibilities. And they can have a frank discussion about it and come to a certain understanding. You cannot have that with the modern state. I cannot sit in a room with the state. I can sit in the room with an official, perhaps, but nowadays that's really hard. You probably have to go through many, many people before you can even get towards something akin to that. So it kind of takes away from the in-person, the local community to something far off, an abstract thing, which is very difficult to actually engage with. What's the downsides of that, of this sort of mafioso feudal system? Well, it is accountable, so we can get to that, but to only a certain extent, right? You can't go to the Godfather and like bully him into your point of view. And the same in early modern Scotland. If your lord doesn't fulfill his obligation fully, it's very difficult to confront him on that point. You have to rely on his honor and of the honor of the people around him. And I think you can see in early modern Scotland that probably is more possible because it's an honor culture, but also everybody nominally or otherwise is Christian. So there's certain ideals and norms in society about which shape the decisions people make, what they value and what's important. You see this in The Godfather too. Vito Corleone is a man of principle at the very least. He will not sell drugs. He refuses to do so, much to the chagrin of other dons. He's an honorable man, and it strikes me that if this fellow who approached him came to him later saying, oh, Godfather, somebody's attacked my shop, the Godfather would uphold his pledge to defend him and wreak retribution on those who've attacked him. So it seems very clear that these are honorable men, so you can hold them to their obligations. But if not, if they're dishonorable, say I think somebody like Tony Soprano, it's going to be a lot harder. So that is a definite weakness in the system. It's one of its issues though is it's non-scalable, or it's very hard to scale up the way. These personal relationships work in a neighborhood, or in the case of early modern Scotland, a geographical area, which the Lord has a domain of influence over through the number of men he has and his ability to access them. If you're talking about a society of the population of the United Kingdom, roughly 60 million, if you're managing it from the top, having those sorts of personal relationships is going to be very difficult to have with every individual in the society. So you will need to have some sort of cascading series of individuals relationships or personal relationships all the way down. But that's really hard to do. And to maintain that kind of structure would be very difficult, especially in a totalizing managerial state. It really requires, well, we'll come to what it really requires in a number of minutes. But that's one of its issues. The Godfather couldn't rule the whole of New York, and this is seen in the fact that there are a number of mafias in the local vicinity. They each have their own neighborhoods, but they can't rule. They couldn't rule America. Let's put it that way. There is also a problem with violence. Now, I've seen in the chat that Byron Brand Stepwise has made a very good point here. That mind academic agents' observation that organized crime reduced the overall crime rates. And this is precisely true. It's in their interest to reduce the number of it's in their interest to police their own areas and make sure that those under their protection are protected. Otherwise, they might go to other sources for help. It's a point of honor, but also it secures their revenue streams too. And this, I think, is undeniable. And I think Lord Inquisitor Ahashlon, great name, he says a similar thing. My area is proof of that observation, Stepwise. Across the river from me used to be controlled by the mob. Used to be nice. They got recoed, and now kids play gunshots or firecrackers and guess. So yes, there is definitely a strong element of policing their own neighborhoods. However, not within the neighborhood, but inter mafia rivalry or inter clan rivalry in early modern Scotland would be very bloody. There was a lot of violence between these various organizations, between various lords, particularly given the honor culture. If one man is slighted or is disrespected, then this is a cause for violence. We saw this in, for example, Chicago with Al Capone and the various attacks on other mafia groups or gangsters. So that's something that you have to bear in mind, that it would be a very violent society, but the violence would be between organizations rather than mass kind of anarcho criminality, let's say. So that's the trade-off in this situation. And by and large, I think I have to let me be more subtle here. Obviously, there's some places in the UK. I know in the US, there's some places where it's far worse. There's some places in the UK where there is a lot of violence, but most people in the UK do not experience violence on a daily basis. It seems to me that these sorts of feudal relationships existed in societies which were extremely violent, and thus it was required that strong bonds of loyalty and mutual obligations were needed to secure people in a violent society. So that's something to bear in mind on that point. So, moving forwards, I've titled this stream A Future of Feudal or Mafioso Relations or Society. And I think that in various ways we may be heading there, regardless of whether it's good or bad. I think there's definitely pluses, there seems to be some minuses, but I think we may be heading to something like that in the future. And let me indicate kind of a number of reasons why I think that's the case. You can categorize them broadly in three groups. And the first is that we live in the modern West increasingly in low trust societies. There's a number of causes of this. One is in recent years political polarization. Whatever end of this political spectrum you're on, it seems people are more divided than ever and genuinely hate those who are on the other side of the aisle, whether it be Brexit, Scottish independence, Republican or Democrat, Black Lives Matter, COVID, etc., etc. All these areas, there seems to be more vitriolic rhetoric, there seems to be more animosity, and there seems to be more of a sense that the other side are less than human and are oppressing and tyrannical. And I think both sides see it that way, which is really strange. But that's kind of where we are. So that means if you know somebody is of the other political persuasion, there's already deep suspicion and doubt about them and deep dislike often. So that reduces trust in society. A second thing which has undermined trust in various ways is mass migration. This point is really starts, at least in the UK, from the era of Tony Blair, where hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people have come to the UK in the last 20 years. And what's important about this is that oftentimes whole communities moved and took over areas. And what I mean by that is it wasn't like they moved and kind of as individuals moved into various areas. It's like whole communities of ethnic group and cultural groups sprung up as their own little units within a city. So, for example, I can think of I grew up in Birmingham, and there was an area, for example, which was mainly dominated by Afro Caribbean people. Then you went to African or Caribbean people, I should say. Then, if you went to another area, it was mainly Pakistani. Another area, it was Indian. Then there was a white area over there, etc., etc. My point is that it wasn't like, oh, everybody just melded into one homogenous group. Actually, there was a number of distinct ethnic cultural areas. And what that did is, in effect, there wasn't multiculturalism and multi-ethnic society really created separate societies, separate areas, especially in a big place like Birmingham, which is massive. It creates spaces which you are an alien in, and vice versa. There were certain areas which were no-go zones for a white British man. I would have come back beaten up at best, probably killed. And it works the other way too. And you find this in various contexts. I think of like Glasgow Rangers and Glasgow Celtic. You know, the Irish population versus the Scottish Protestant population there. There's strong animosity. So this kind of happening all over the country, and I'm sure there's similar cases in Europe and in America too, and elsewhere. It creates a low trust society fundamentally because you've got different groups with their own in-group preferences, siphoning off from each other, and this causes conflict and low trust. But these things in themselves would not create a completely low trust society where something like the mafia would grow back, right? What really does it, I think, in part, is that people do not trust the police and judicial systems to protect them and enact justice, particularly in recent years. And I can only really speak of the British context here. But again, I've seen enough in other countries to think it's a trend across the West. For example, the police in the UK seem ineffectual and prioritizing things which are not important at the expense of protecting ordinary people. We see this in a number of examples. For example, the Rotherham sex gangs, which existed, where thousands of girls were raped, and the police and the judicial system did nothing out of fear of being called racist. That's appalling, absolutely appalling. One man, he knew his daughter was being held in one of these houses. He went there to confront the gang, and he was arrested by the police because they thought he was going to kill somebody. Can you just think about that for a second? The father who wanted to protect his daughter was arrested, but his daughter was allowed to remain in this building. So but then we can look at a more modern example. You can see that knife crime in London has skyrocketed in recent years. It's in double figures. It's exceeding each year upon each year, and it's young men and women are getting killed and brutalized by each other. And this is in the context while the police in London are emphasizing things like we need to be stricter on hate speech online. We need to be promoting a more tolerant society. They'll take the knee when confronted with Black Lives Matters, but when people are being stabbed, that's just allowed to carry on indefinitely. It's absolutely disgraceful, but it undermines the idea that they can protect and that they are able to enact justice. This is perhaps even more demonstrated in the fact that these sorts of distortions, these sorts of failures of protection are gaslighted by the media and by the powers that be. And at the same time, the real issues that they like to promote are gaslighting too. I think, for example, of the fact that, was it last year? Things seem to have moved very quickly. Last year, in the Black Lives Matters protests, there was a number of riots where people burnt down buildings, looted shops. They were people were killed. I think about 20 people were killed in these riots. And yet the media and various democratic politicians came out in support of these movements, doing this, totally ignoring this aspect of it. All the while, you know, a dad complaining at a school board about the policies of the school is branded a terrorist and arrested, let's say. It just creates this culture or this climate where many people don't feel they are protected, and that it's fundamentally unjust. The state is unjust. And we can see in that context then, where there's a low trust society already, and there's no belief that the state can uphold protection or justice, that something like a feudal relationship could exist. or begin to exist. And this is going to become more and more the case, I think, when people who are politically undesirable, so folks who have the wrong points of view in this society, are marginalized and excluded from mainstream society. I think of somebody like Laura Towler, for example, one of the co-founder of Patriotic Alternative. I want to just say quickly, I disagree fundamentally with a lot of what they say. But she had her bank account closed because of her political points of view. So this is somebody essentially unable to operate within modern society. If you don't have a bank account, you can't use most of the things of it. You can't purchase much these days, especially when cash is being eliminated. So the kind of non-state providers of protection and justice will become more and more important, and entering into these individual mutual relationships will become more and more necessary for such groups who are systematically made into an underclass outside of the support and protection of the state. This leads to the kind of second big area, which I think allows for the development of feudal and mafia type things in the future in the modern West, and that's systemic changes. One of these is, ironically, and don't all balk at this, but globalization. Now, we can think of globalization in a number of different ways. There are so many definitions these days, almost to ad nauseum. But one is just that process by which there is more interconnectivity around the world in terms of trade, in terms of information flow, in terms of travel, so on. And this causes a major problem for most governments, because if if people are essentially operating on a global level across national boundaries, then it's almost impossible to have total control over their lives, at least from a nation state's perspective. We've seen this with the internet, for example. It's almost impossible for a single government, that is, to control what people see, because you can just find a server on the other side of the world putting it out there. As long as somebody can get access to it, it's possible to spread that information. What we find is that actually the process of globalization fragment control. They open up spaces between countries, or above the borders of countries, we might say, or under them, that it's really difficult to actually clamp down on in any context. And this creates room for individual relationships of mutual obligation to flourish in this sort of context. Now, we can see the Great Reset, or these sorts of globalist movements, where big capital corporations, hedge funds, NGOs, and intergovernmental organizations are coming together to try and control globalization. And this is essentially recognizing the problem that states can't control its processes, and trying to get a rein on the system and drive it in a certain direction. So that might be a counter to this perspective that I'm offering. But it certainly, to me, then indicates that the fragmentary nature of globalization is actually a space for opportunity at the moment, and it's not done and dusted what way it's going to go yet. So then that leads to the third area that I wanted to talk about as a possible opening up of feudal and mafioso sorts of relationship, and that is crisis. And I don't mean Boris Johnson had a party kind of crisis. That's not going to cut it. I mean civilizational catastrophe in some way or another. I have a number of possible examples here. I was thinking if we I appreciate the science is contested in various quarters on the internet, but let's take, for argument's sake, climate change, for example, floods emerging or whatever. We could think in terms of nuclear catastrophe. So if there was a nuclear war somewhere, that might do it. It could also just be the plans of the global elites. I think that's very likely to cause crises in the near future. Specifically, regardless of what climate change is going to do, their plans are going to radically change our economies, and in turn, they're going to change how food is collected and stored. They're going to take control of water supply, of energy, and so on. They're going to be pooling these resources because essentially they're going to be needed if this climate catastrophe is going to happen, right? And they're going to try and fundamentally change them. I think what this is going to do is create massive shortages in the future. Because if you're going to limit the amount of food people can have, that's going to be a precarious situation. If you're going to ration the amount of water a country can have, or you're going to lift water from the UK and share it around the world, let's say, because that's the sort of vision they have. They want everything to be equal and equally distributed. Well, you're going to have a lot of shortages for a lot of people. This will probably be exacerbated by the fact that the current monetary approaches are going to see massive economic collapse at some point in the future. And jobs are just going to disappear overnight. This is particularly problematic in a society where, and I'm one of these people, most of us have kind of, I want to say like icing on the cake jobs. What I mean by that is my job as a researcher of early modern Scotland is not critical to the basic fabric of society. It deals with values, it deals with tradition, and that is super important. But when push comes to shove, it's not going to build infrastructure. It's not going to be able to distribute food. It's not going to be able to generate energy. I guess that's where I'm coming from. So, and there's a disproportionate number of folks in that sort of area. So you're going to have a lot of people unemployed. You're going to have massive shortages. And in a low trust context, I can't see the state retaining control of many areas for very long. What you're going to find is that those groups which have control over resources will become extremely powerful. And my mind was drawn to something like the zombie apocalypses, at least as we see them in our media. Something like The Walking Dead, where after the apocalypse, where most people have become zombies, there's only a few survivors across America. And essentially, our heroes form a group, and people die along the way, other people join. But at one point, they meet a group called the Saviors. Oh, spoilers for The Walking Dead, by the way, but it's been out so long. And the Saviors are run by a man called Negan. And I should say as well, I'm basing it on the TV show. I've not read the comics. I'm a terrible fan, I know. And Negan he's a really interesting character. The way that the group is built, the Saviors, is that there is his kind of foot soldiers, the gang, and they are essentially like his mafia or his men. And then underneath them are I guess, slaves or serfs. But it's not as clear as that, because it seems that many of them have come voluntarily. And although they're not treated very well, and there's a climate of terror, at least that's kind of how the TV show presents it. Many of them are very appreciative of Negan because he brings protection, they are fed, and he keeps men in check. If they overstep the mark, he disciplines them. He makes sure that there isn't violence within the camp. That's super valuable in a context where there are limited resources and there are major threats outside, there are other gangs and so on. So we can, I think, and I could be completely wrong. I'm going to accept that. This is all very speculative, and I haven't got like stats to back this up. I can't make a model where somebody, some famous internet man was talking about like multivariable controls and multi-factorial models of the future we need to predict it and all this sort of thing. Elite theory doesn't work, it's too reductive. But yeah, it seems to me that in that sort of context where you can't rely on the state to feed you or to provide you with water, others will. You're going to pledge your loyalty. You're going to pledge your service to them, especially when things really go down south. This might be harder in some countries than others. I think in America, with its federal system and its kind of vast distances between places, it's probably more possible. It's harder to control. Whereas the United Kingdom, it's going to be a lot tougher for something like that to fully emerge in the beginning, because it's well, it may. I guess that it's relatively easy for the state to lose control of places if they go wild, and it would go wild quickly if there was food shortages of a major scale. So I think that's a real possibility moving forward, regardless of whether the predictions of the end of times is true. There does seem to be moves towards these sorts of things, and amongst the ambitions of the global elite, or whether it's just something else which causes it. Nuclear catastrophe, for example, which we all seem to have forgotten about, but it seemed a big deal 50 years ago. Now it never seems to be a concern to anybody, except for anti-Trumpers, of course. So yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at with it. I think that in those contexts where there's a complete collapse, you're going to see feudal relationships re-emerge. And that will have definite pluses, strong accountability, strong individual local relationships. But man, it's in a time of crisis. Things ain't going to be good. It might be worth, though, thinking forward about this sort of idea, that actually, people talk about building networks and kind of strengthening ties between people, rather than think. The problem with that sort of talk at the moment is it still operates within the current model, and thus it's going to be largely ineffectual if it ever had the opportunity of taking some sort of power. Whereas if people start thinking about building these sorts of feudal relationships earlier on, then you've already got something strong that can perhaps provide protection, justice, but also a platform to build on in ensuing crisis. I don't even know where you would have to begin with that, but it's worth thinking about as a future option. I suppose to a certain extent you do see it in some countries, although it's still rather contractual. I was thinking of like in South Africa, you have a lot of private protection firms, but that's not really the same as this, because again, that's I pay you money and you protect me. If there was a crisis, those guys aren't going to protect you anymore. Whereas in a feudal relationship, you can at least guarantee some protection. Maybe I'm thinking of the serf here. I'm thinking of the Nietzsche was very critical of most people as being cowards, and the servant mentality. Perhaps I'm thinking of this in my feudal thinking, but I don't want everybody to suffer in the apocalypse. Is that so bad? Anyway, so that's what I was thinking about with feudalism and whatnot. So we have some time for questions or comments or anything you want to raise. It can be related to what I've said, or it could be part of the Ask Me Anything. So get your questions in. While you are doing that, I'm going to just plug something for next week. So on the 12th of February, which is a Saturday, this channel is going to host a discussion of C.S. Lewis's novel That Hideous Strength. It's the third in a trilogy, but it stands alone, his science fiction novel. And I'm delighted that, Lord willing, I will be joined by Radslib, Lambda Bible Studies, i.e. Luke, Amy / Gagging for Lit, and our very wonderful Apostolic Majesty, who I see is in the chat. Hello, sir. We're going to be discussing it for a couple of hours, and it should be a really good, interesting thing to discuss. I think particularly because the book, I like it because it doesn't, the classic novels which discuss totalitarianism, 1984, A Brave New World, they discuss totalitarianism from the point of view of it having been established for a while, whereas That Hideous Strength really goes into the processes by which a totalitarian attempts to take over, and the tactics that they use and the philosophy underlying it. And it's very prescient for the current moment. You will see so much in it that you see today. And this was written, 90 years ago now. So it's amazing. And it's going to be a great panel too. They're all brilliant people with lots of interesting thoughts. And so I'm really looking forward to it. So make sure you tune in for then. So let's see, what have people been saying across the room? Thank you, sir, for your comment. Right now, most people seem to be picking a random rural location and hoping for the best. Rural people aren't exactly the warm, welcoming types fiction presents them as being. No, and perhaps in rural communities, there is a stronger sense of kind of individual personal relationships with the in-group, the folks who have lived there for however long. And so outsiders who, well, let's be clear as well, a lot of people who move out to the country are not interested in forming these sorts of deep personal relationships of obligation with the locals. They want to live their city life, but without the busyness of the city in the countryside. So they're not asking to be friends of the Godfather, as it were. They just want to have a nice life in the country. That's not true of all. Obviously, there's some who are taking the kind of political side situation more seriously and moving out in preparation. But I do think that the issue is, okay, you've moved out, but what happens when the crisis occurs and you run out of energy? Okay, you can have a generator for a while, but you'll run out of petrol eventually. So what are you going to do? You're going to have to find somebody to pledge your allegiance to for these goods. Or at least I hope you will, because the other way it could go is more like the Tony Soprano kind of mafia, where they just sell you electricity at extortionate prices, and there's no kind of loyalty there. That's the other way it could go, and given how our society lacks honor in any real sense, that's a good possibility. So that's why I think we need to really start thinking about that. You could have like in Canada, the truckers, maybe they need to form like proper feudal ties to one another if they want to survive into the apocalypse. Let's see. So, thank you very much across the room. Apostolic Majesty, good to see you. Thoughts on the mafia portrayal in Goodfellas? I must admit, I saw Goodfellas many years ago, and I couldn't really speak to it that well. The only scene I particularly remember is when what's the guy's name? Joe Pesci shoots a bartender in the foot for insulting him. Which, on the one hand, confirms the very violent character of the mafia. At the same time, it does also reflect the emphasis on honor and respect, and that I believe that bartender disrespected Joe Pesci in some way or another. I mean, Joe Pesci's character is not honorable. That's true. So maybe that's part of it. Yes, but I'm sorry, I couldn't. I need to go back and rewatch the film. AM. My apologies. Caleb Frank, thank you for your question. Excellent picture, by the way. Do you foresee clan structures re-emerging in a time of crisis? I do, if the central power has lost control. So if well, even if it hasn't lost total control, but enough control that groups will re-emerge, whether there is this close tie and affinity, whether it be a clan, so family based, I'm not sure. I don't think we live in a society where kinship groups are as strong as they once were. So I would, and they're not as extended in the same way, right? But certainly something to that effect could form over time. Again, in The Walking Dead, you basically see that with like the groups of survivors are essentially clans of various kinds, and they act in the common interest of each other as forms of protection against others. I think this will particularly form if there's issues to do with resources. And yeah, I think if groups form around the distribution and of resources, then they will be of a clan-like nature, because money is not going to be as important as having protection, as having protection and justice for your side. Especially in a context where like money is not going to buy you as much, or if anything at all. AM again. Thoughts on Edward Dutton's videos on our Mafia future? I had no idea that Edward Dutton had done videos on our Mafia future. I feel very silly now for doing this discussion when I didn't know that. So yes, I will need to go and watch that, and I will let you know in due course, AM, what I think on it. But he's always a very astute fellow, so I'm sure he's got very many good points on them. Minoan, thank you for your question. I'm born and bred rural. I will pop any city slicker on the spot if they try to parasitic my community in apocalypse. And trust me, we can see the parasites a mile away. Well, precisely. So interesting. You identified we can see. So it's going to be a group of you, right? It's going to be a clan. And I guess though the question will be, how long can you guys keep going for? Okay, you might be able to produce food, I'm sure, and water. But what about something like electricity? Will you be able to get that? That would be the question. If you can't get food and water, if you run out at some point, you're going to need to trade with somebody. You may need a bigger group. That's where something like the feudal lord or the mafia thing kind of emerges. But even in your group, you would need to have some kind of loyalty structure, right? You couldn't just be a bunch of individuals working together. That's going to collapse very quickly when there's scarce supply. But yes, noted. I will be avoiding your town, Minoan, for sure. Caleb Frank, thank you again for your point. I can see clans appearing more in rural places rather than cities, except perhaps based on gangs rather than familiar ties. Yes, totally. Well, that's what I think. Like based on gangs rather than familiar ties, for sure. I guess I do think though you'll see it in cities, particularly. I think there's more likelihood of it actually in cities in some ways because with utter collapse, most people in cities will need to go somewhere for their food and their resources and their energy, right? They can't, they're not self sufficient and they don't exist in self sufficient communities. So they're going to have to find people who can distribute it and provide them protection. Even today, I mean, the mafia primarily operate in cities, right? So if you need protection and the state can't offer it to you, it's going to form up there. So I do think there's a good chance it'll form in cities. Maybe clans in the countryside and the mafia in the city. It's going to be great, isn't it? The Chofi, thank you for your comment. The realization that civilizational decline and catastrophe seems to be the only way for decentralization of power is a bit black feeling, to be honest. Yes, and I think it's scary. I don't think we should pretend it's not. I know Mr. D kind of makes this point in somewhat rebuking tones, but like the collapse of civilization is going to be really painful, and a lot of folks won't make it in that sort of society. There's going to have to be a lot of it's going to be really tough. That's why I think that's why in part I think the zombie apocalypse idea really appeals to a lot of people, or it makes good viewing because we kind of know that sort of society is going to be what happens if what we had now collapsed in some way or another. It's yeah, so I think it's very blackpilling, but I also see it as I don't see it as the end though. I think that's a point. Societies have kind of gone like this at various points or another, and yet early modern Scotland was like this decentralized form, and from it grew many beautiful things. Many of them not so great, but many beautiful things. So it's not maybe on a civilizational level, it's a point of optimism, perhaps to a certain degree. But for the individual, it is a scary prospect. I don't think we should make any bones about it. It may not be in our lifetime. I think that's an important point. I have a foreboding sense that it could be when I'm an old man that this happens, and then then I'm really stuck, right? But if it could be 100, 200 years, I don't know. It's just an interesting idea, and it does seem that our systems at the moment are very fragile. We don't have strong bonds. I think that's the thing I really appreciate about the feudal relationship. It's a strong bond that can survive a lot, whereas our systems of food, energy, water, and then beyond that, our systems of communication and so on. If you turn off the computer servers, I mean, it all crashes overnight, right? So it's it's really fragile. It's not like a self-sustaining community where there's a problem on the other side of the world, doesn't affect you. So yeah, it's it's not good. It's not good. It's a house of cards waiting to fall down, I guess. But I could be completely wrong. That's the other thing. I'm not an expert. I'm not a fortune teller. It's just my perspective at the moment. But yeah, it is blackpilling. But maybe that's why we should be proactive, I guess, if it's even possible at this point. I should go back to this one first. Great man. Across the room, in the US, perhaps most rural areas have been decimated by deaths of despair. The claim zombie apocalypse hit them before the city folk. Yeah, that's very sad. That's very sad and very true, unfortunately. That's a question, but I want to thank you for doing this stream. I'm not sure whether it's a quirk of our appreciation of feudalism, but I've had very similar thoughts concerning our feudal future. Very interesting, AM. Well, thank you for watching and contributing through the chat. I much appreciate it. And yeah, maybe we should talk about this more sometime. Get Radlib on. I know he's a fan of medieval anarcho culture or whatever. Yeah. And thanks also to Caleb Frank for your comments too. Let me get it up. Yeah, thank you, sir. Opinions on the Scots Covenanters, for or against? Well, thank you, Joseph Langmead. I mean, I could do a whole other stream on this. So it's I'll try not to go off on one here. I think there's so many points to raise here. Where to even begin? Well, the first thing is I think that in the historiography, there's a strong anti-Covenanter bias in recent historiography, and that is a reaction to previous historiography, which has been very pro-Covenanter. That's been primarily written by Scottish Presbyterian men who saw them as kind of precursors of modern democratic movements in some ways, in the sense that they resisted a king trying to impose his ecclesiastical approach upon Scotland, and thus are kind of tying that in with Samuel Rutherford's political theory. It's consent, God's will is through the consent of the people. So it's kind of a precursor to the great things of the Scottish Enlightenment. When you move to more recent historiography, there's a lot of criticism of the idea that actually they were a kind of theocratic society, that they tried to impose their religious norms upon Scotland, that they purged. Well, at one point there was a purge of the army, of anybody who kind of dissented, and that I've heard, and it was on a BBC show. One or two scholars compare early modern Covenanting Scotland to Iran, to modern day Iran, which, maybe there's some truth in it. I don't dispute that, but why would you want to make that comparison out of all of them? And this connects, I think, to their religious beliefs. The Covenanters were deeply religious people who their form of spirituality was, how to put it, it was very experiential. They believed that one should have experiences of God in prayer, in worship, in reading the Bible, and that these would be ecstatic and ravishing in various ways. That these experiences of God, which transform you and make you love God more, these powerful experiences could give you knowledge about your own life, your standing with God, but also how to run your life, what decisions you should take, etc., etc. So you could call it, well, in the polemical language of the day, it was enthusiastic. That means that they believed that their kind of religion was revealed by God, and their way of doing things was based on revelation of God, both in scripture, but also in their own experience. This, to the modern secular liberal mind, is awful. A way of structuring society not on neutral universal reason, which, let's be clear, doesn't exist, but grounded in supernatural revelation, which can't be shared. This was a critique made at the time by moderate Anglicans. They said that the civil wars were caused by the fact that so many groups claimed to have true revelation from God, and so didn't, which couldn't be shared, and so they came into conflict with one another. Now, that's not really the case because many of these groups were on the same side, so it doesn't make sense as an argument. But we see this argument brought forward by the new atheists, right? They say religious belief, particularly fundamentalism, which is kind of belief in special revelation about the the nature of the world and what we should do, is the cause of most violence in history, indeed most oppression in history. If there was no religion, the world would be so peaceful. And I think that, you see, so then to tie the Covenanters' religious program with Iran is to essentially say that they are fundamentalists, they are illiberal, and it's essentially a way of dismissing both their political point of view and their religious beliefs. Because if you can say that they're religious, well, and this is tied into another point. I won't go into it tonight. It's too much. I've probably already got in trouble with the historians of this topic on so many things I've said in this stream. But the idea that, yeah, it's a way of dismissing them as a live option, that any of their ideas could be true. Because they're evidently not if they're like Iran, right? So that's a big precursor. Personally, I think that the Covenanters were very sincere individuals. I think that I mean, it was a diverse group. Not every Covenanter was the same. I appreciate that they structured their lives on loving God, and that was what they considered most important, even if it took them down the wrong path on a number of cases. It made them very politically not very savvy because they were very hardcore in their beliefs and very pure. I guess they were the cousins of the Puritans, right? I guess I would say I'm not really for or against. In the sense that I'm more interested in just studying them and seeing the good things and the bad things in them. And the same with the other side. Like, I'm not for or against King Charles I. I think he had some really good character traits. Like, he was devoted to Anglicanism and believed it was true religion. And that can't be discounted from why he tried to impose it on Scotland. He wanted to bring true religion to Scotland. Like, I think that's a good quality. I think he was a bad politician, and he made some really bad governmental decisions, such as inciting the Engagers to try and break him out of prison. That was a really bad move on his part. But in general, I guess what I would say, sorry, this is a really bad answer to your question, but I kind of want to say I'm for all of these people back then because they were all a lot more based. And I think in general, the worldview that I inhabit would be shared with them more than most people today. So things like the natural order of the world, and breaking the natural order in one area has a cataclysmic effect on all others. This is an idea most people back then would have shared. An emphasis on communion with God, an emphasis upon hierarchical society. These are things most people would have affirmed, and I kind of love them for that. I love them even though they differ, they had much more honor and sincerity. So, yeah, I guess I'm for them then, Joseph. I guess I'm for them. Thank you for your question. Minoan, responding to across the room, and I guess this is to do with the point about the, let's see, deaths of despair in rural communities. To be fair, AM, some of them are very good scholars, but I think one of the things I've noticed in history, and I'm sure they think the same about me too on Twitter, is that it's one thing to be a very good historical scholar of a topic and do good kind of close analysis of evidence, right? It's another thing then to engage that with the present and what's important in the present. And suddenly it the close analysis of evidence doesn't become relevant in that sort of discussion, because if you're saying to me, are the Covenanters, did they have a good society? That's not something I can really tell by my historical ability. It becomes a question of philosophy, of ethics. And so it's almost like talking to a different person because you're engaging a different area. They might not be really an expert in ethics. They may not have particularly distinctive views on that point. So I think, yeah, to be fair, there are really good scholars who hold the points of view that I'm kind of mentioning. But when it comes to actually assessing these people, it just goes out of the window completely because it's not relevant to the discussion in some way or another. Yeah, and I would say they're actually really good. I've learned so much from them, and I'm not just saying that because I think because we were looking last week at the Tolkien article where the guy was just like being really pernickety about the word mythology. To me, that's not very good scholarship as an approach. Whereas it's not like that in the early modern Scotland field. It's actually most of it's really good in general. Perhaps because it's quite small, so there's a lot of room for original exploration. But as I say, as soon as it gets to the broader points of ethics or political philosophy, it's different entirely. Thank you, Raspberry Treacle. Much appreciated. That is an excellent picture as well, my friend. I love that. Well, just give a few minutes for any more questions. And as I say, it can be about the topic we've discussed. It could be about something else entirely. Anything really. And there's no super chats, so you don't have to pay for it too. Do it while you can. Who knows? I mean, I saw that I'm about 800 hours of people viewing my channel away from monetization. So, get onto it. Keep watching, guys. And then maybe one day I'll be able to get some super chats. But till then, you can ask me any questions. Seriously though, I don't know if I would do super chats. I'm unsure. I do like the I think if I started monetizing, I'd have to do more videos, right? Maybe that's a good thing. At the same time, it's like I kind of like the fact that I stream like once every 2 months, but then I have a good topic, something I've thought about a bit. I've got massive respect for the guys who can do it week in, week out at consistently high level, like Apostolic Majesty. He's a great example of this. Every week, fantastic streams and videos. Academic Agent too, like every week, original content. It's amazing. It's amazing to me. But yes, I don't know where I was going with that. Yeah, get your questions in while you can. I guess one question would be if we do have these feudal relationships, who are we going to pledge our allegiances to? Could we even do it? Could a modern person really pledge themselves in that sort of feudal way? Would they find it too unconscionable? Would the liberal mind enable them to do that? I don't know. It would definitely feel weird. It would have to be somebody. Well, you may not get a choice, but if we think of like Carlyle's hero, who inspires loyalty just by who they are and the things they say and what they do, that's somebody you could pledge your loyalty to. So, and fealty and make a bond of manrent. So perhaps if there's heroes, I remember somebody tweeting like a young man giving a speech to a bunch of students who were going to defy the mask mandate in schools. He seemed like one day he could be our feudal lord. Um, but there's not many like folks like that, I think. Or if there are, then, well, no, there may well be in our circles, but it's hard to tell through YouTube, right? YouTube is not the sort of place that you necessarily see the heroic in people. You hear a lot of intellectuals who don't tend to be the heroes. They tend to be like, at best, like Merlin on the side, the advisor, the counselor. Maybe that's what I'll do. I'll be the counselor to the feudal lord. That's what I'll try and get. We've got a couple more questions here. Virile Journey, thank you for your question. How do you think churches will fare in Mafia time? That's a good question. Well, I certainly think that if kind of feudal mafia type relationships are going to spring up, then that means that there is less control of the state over life, including religion. At the moment, we can see that the state can close churches when it wants to, or most churches at the very least. We can see that if somebody disobeys a hate speech crime nowadays from the pulpit, they'll be arrested. So the state can control what's said in church, what's done in church, and when church meets, as it stands, right? I'm not saying it's like that everywhere in the UK, but it can do that. It's not going to be like that in Mafia time. So that gives the opportunity for people to worship. I guess if it's real severe crisis like the apocalypse, then you're not going to have folks going on a Sunday morning along to the local church unless it's within the protection of the mafia, of the feudal lord, of Negan. So you're probably going to have much smaller churches in that regard, but they'll be protected. Indeed, if it might be the religion of that clan, let's say. So it might be a better situation. It's going to be harder to maintain national church structures, right? So that's not going to be great in that regard, but maybe that's a good thing too. I don't know how the bishops in kind of Catholic or Anglican contexts are going to do, how they're going to administer their diocese. That might be a bit tricky. But then, see, this is probably something like Columba would be good at speaking about. You know, in kind of when the first missionaries came to like Northumberland, like St. Aidan, it was probably not too dissimilar from Mafia time. The kind of feudal lords and clans and so on. A bit of a Wild West, but holy men were kind of respected and kind of welcomed into court and so on. So perhaps it might allow for that sort of culture, a return to Celtic monasticism of some kind. But that would presuppose that people would honor and acknowledge the church as important. And that's going to take a massive change in people's worldviews. So I think it could do well. It would look very different, but it could do well, especially as well. I think if the state collapses, then many of the things that the state promotes, and by the state I don't just mean the actual state. I mean like conglomerations, corporations, etc. If these things are not pumping their points of view, their worldview into society, then those barriers which get in the way of faith are not going to be there as well. And the churches, at least at their best, promote that which is most true about the world and thus corresponds to human nature. And so it will be the kind of naturally more accessible, I guess, or make more sense in such a world than our own, which deliberately tries to argue against the Christian faith in so many ways. Wow, this stream, I feel like I've walked a tightrope on so many of these questions, and in many senses. Thank you, Virajani. That was a good question. Chofi, favorite video? Do you mean YouTube video or just favorite film? I'm not sure. If it's YouTube video, I don't know what I would say for that. I guess I would say in terms of channels, beyond the ones that you guys probably all know, like Apostolic Majesty, Academic Agent, Lambda Bible Studies, I've got to admit that I've got a couple of guilty pleasures. There's a channel called Big Mooney, who he does a lot of video games, but it's he got famous for doing this one kind of stream where he would do Hitman kill everybody challenges, and they're really good fun. He's very creative with them. He's just a really creative YouTuber, and he's a bit different. So yeah, he's probably one of them. And the other is Tifo football channel. Okay, I know I'm a complete normie in that respect. But what I really like about them is they go into like deep tactical analysis of like managers, teams, football games, and give you a bit of a more than kind of what you would get on Match of the Day. It's much more in depth, and I've learnt a lot through it. So yeah. Oh, I just see that it's slang for video games. No problem, Trophy. So, it's changed a number of times. I used to love Rome Total War. That used to be my go-to. The original one, not the one that came out later. Medieval Total War as well. Crusader Kings 2, that was good. I mean, I've got to throw FIFA in. FIFA's great just for like if you need to just unwind. I find that's good. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 1, 2, and 3. Those were my babies. I do love a good RPG like Skyrim or The Witcher. Red Dead Redemption 2 I loved. I guess XCOM's been a good game as well. I've been playing recently. I guess what I would say is my favorite game changes every couple of months, but I really love a game for a while and then move on. But if I was going to say my favorite ever, that's really tough. I want to say Skyrim because I think the first time I played Skyrim was the first time I played an RPG, and man, what a game to play! It just running out into an open world where I had no idea what I was doing, right? So I just ran off and got like killed 100 times, but it was great, like existing in that way. So many good memories with it. Maybe that's why I like feudal relationships. I like the Jarls; they're great. Although the Dragonborn's a bit of a disruptor, right? He breaks all of these relationships in some ways or another. So maybe he's the real enemy of order in Skyrim. He's the real modern man in Skyrim. I don't know. Yes, I have very normie taste in video games. I'm unashamed on that front. Yeah, I save my eclectic taste for books and pastimes, I guess, beyond video games. Sorry to disappoint. Oh, hello, Byron, good to see you as always. If you could enable super chats, I promise to give you £1. Well, if everybody watches my channel day and night, maybe one day it will get there. But then at the same time, I'm like, you keep your £1, mate. Spend it on yourself. But it's a very kind sentiment. What I want is not £1, but friendship, Byron Brandt. I want you to pledge your loyalty to me. I want you to promise to serve me, and I will protect you. That's what I really want. I don't want your super chats. I think I've got a bit crazy. Right. Hello AI. Good to see you. Great man. I am hoping that you'll get back to doing videos eventually. I don't know if you've done one recently, but I was on your channel a while back and looking for a new video, but I've not seen one. I missed them. What is your Christian themed video game, and why is it Elder Scrolls Morrowind? I see. I'm so normie that I've not even played Morrowind. I've only played Skyrim from the Elder Scrolls. I know, awful, absolutely awful. Well, maybe favorite Christian themed video. Well, surely it has to be. Wait for it. The Lord of the Rings Two Towers PS2 game, right? Because the Lord of the Rings is thoroughly Christian themed, and in that game you get to play all the characters. I love the second one. It was so good. I mean, it's probably awful, but looking back now, but getting to play as Aragorn or Legolas or Gimli and fight your way through hordes. I can picture it now in my mind. Like there's this one when you're in the Gap of Rohan or the West Fold, and you have to defend like villagers from Urukai in abandoned sheds. So good. That's the best Christian themed video game, my friend. Good to see you again. Oh well, that's an interesting question. I find it interesting though that like all the Empire apologists are like, well, we need to be pro Empire because well, the Empire will help us resist the Thalmor. So even the justification for the Empire is like nationalist in some sense, right? It's kind of we belong as a group, and those guys need to be overthrown. Or maybe nationalist maybe isn't the right word, but it's still like an in-group preference thing. Fundamentally, I don't know anybody who kind of supports the Empire because it's like multicultural, for example. I've never heard anybody make that argument. Maybe some of you have. Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting. I love oh, there's a DLC where there's this island off the coast of Skyrim. I can't remember its name now. But there's like the Scaldi there. They're my favorites. With the Reichling warriors, is it? And they have like a fight or something. It's been a while. Hello, CM Piano 2. Really lovely to see you. And if you haven't already, guys, subscribe to CM Piano 2. He did a lovely arrangement of music from the Lord of the Rings for Tolkien Day, and it was just beautiful, really worth the follow, and very apt that you're asking this question. Favorite album? Again, it changes with the weather or the months. I think of all time, I would say Blood on the Tracks by Bob Dylan. I love that album so much. I think he does a brilliant job of moving through a series of emotions, both musically and lyrically. There's just so many great songs on that album. Just really, there's a beautiful sorrow in there, but also hope, especially in something like Tangled Up in Blue or Shelter from the Storm. Just wonderful. if it was of the current moment, I would have two favorite albums of the current moment that I've just been. Every time I go to work, I just put them on shuffle and listen to them as I'm working. They're just great. So one of them, let me make sure I've got the right name for it, because it's a long one. So it is by T-Rex, as in Mark Bolan, or Tyrannosaurus Rex, I should say. And this was while I think this was his first album, and he was partnered up by, let me see if I can find his name. I'm gonna get his name right. Uh, what's his name? Steve Peregrine Took. That's a great name, isn't it? He changed his name to Peregrine Took. So this guy loved the Lord of the Rings, so that was always a great in for me. And their first album was called "My People Were Fair and Had Sky in Their Hair, but now they're content to wear stars on their brows." It's like that gives you a sense of this album. It's very psychedelic folk music. It's like the bongos and a guitar. It's just really interesting what they do lyrically and musically, and just like nothing I'd ever heard before. The first time I heard it, I think it was after I did a stream with maybe it was with AM after the one of the Tolkien Day streams. Yeah, it was after the political philosophy of Tolkien stream. I put that on. I'd had a few beers. My mind was just blown away. It was great. So I'd recommend that. And then the other album that I've been getting into a lot recently is Argus by Wishbone Ash. Kind of similar fantastical themes in the lyrics. Wow, that album is fantastic. And there's some really underappreciated ones on it. What's it called? I wish I could play these for you, but I know it would be copyright struck. Low and Free. That's a really good one. But yeah, so Bob Dylan, uh, the Bob Dylan Blood on the Tracks, and then more recently Tyrannosaurus Rex and Wishbone Ash. Those would be my answers for favorite albums. Maybe we need to do maybe I should do a Desert Island Discs with a number of folks in our sphere one day. Wouldn't that be fun? We could get on a number of folks, and if we can find a way around the copyright, it would be good fun. But yes, that could be an idea. Maybe one day when I've got a bit more time. Byron Brand, very well. Well, I hope that's very well in terms of you are pledging your allegiance to me, sir. But if not, I'll let you off for the time being. Shia Tori. I'm starting to create more videos. Great to hear, sir. I look forward to checking them out. On Morrowind, your character is called Never Rain. Okay, I'm gonna have a look at who is Never Rain. Is this some kind of insult or great thing? Who is Never Rain? Oh, I'm on the Elder Scrolls wiki. Is that a reliable thing? He's got a cool sword. The Protector of Morrowind is the reincarnation of Indoril Nevervar, as well as the player character and protagonist of. Oh, it jumped. He sounds cool. I'm gonna check him out later, but he sounds epic. So I'll take that. I think. um, oh, that's good to hear. They're good like slashers, aren't they? And there's just something because it's got the proper film music. I was never like a massive fan of the third one in some ways because I felt like the camera angle was a bit too far out. I preferred the Two Towers one, which was more intimate. Is that the right word? It was close up anyway. But yeah, I am. I like them both a lot. I never played the Fellowship of the Ring one, just because the Two Towers included the Fellowship, didn't it? So, oh, and then there was that game, not Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War, which that's a whole other discussion, right? If we're talking about Amazon changing the lore, Shadow of Mordor, that's next level. But maybe that was the beginning. But there was a game, was it like the Third Age or something like that? It was like a turn-based game. You played as like characters who paralleled the main quest, and kind of ended up fighting Sauron at the end. It was a bit weird, but I liked it. PS2 was it? Yeah, the Lord of the Rings: The Third Age. That was a really good game. I liked it a lot. Um, a lot of grinding though, I remember. But you did get a sense of like the environments were very good. No problems. CM Piano. We'll still subscribe to him anyway. Trophy. Lots of people make up the Stormcloaks to be racist and pick the Empire based on that. But considering Skyrim is minority Nord, you can blame them. Yeah, well, it's true. They only really dominate the Northeast, right? I guess though, like there is a lot of prejudice in is it Winterhold? Winterhold, that's right, isn't it? I'm showing my bad knowledge here. Or is it the other? Where does? No, that's not right. Where am I thinking of, people? What's the Windhelm? Thank you, AM. I'm so sorry. If we ever do like the um lore of Skyrim, you cannot count on me. Oh, and Solstheim. Yes, Solstheim. Yes, that's where I was thinking of. Um, yeah, they are like anti, like what the lizard people called. They don't like the lizards. The lizard men. Maybe they're like the Alex Joneses of Skyrim. But but then the Empire is based on the same principle, right? It's like we don't like the Thalmor running us, and we don't like the Thalmor being here because we are Imperials. So I know Tullius is a bit more pragmatic, but his this oh, what's her name? I should, yeah. He has this assistant, doesn't he? The female. Oh, she like knows. She's like deeply involved in the Civil War quest. Anyway, so yeah, I'm not totally convinced that like the Imperials aren't racist by the same standard that the Stormcloaks are being held to. So, you know, uh, it's all selective in that regard. But yeah, Solstheim, that's where it's really at. I mean, that is very much like a wilderness, isn't it? So maybe that's why it appeals to me. Yeah, you do need to get around to Bob Dylan. He's absolutely wonderful in all of his eras. I even love his song "Country Pie." Great lyricism. um, yeah, but some of his modern stuff's really good, like Modern Times or Tempest. That's super, and even the most recent album. There needs to be a bit more of a deep dive on that sort of stuff, I guess, at some point. I know AA did things, but I do think the modern era gets neglected a lot when people talk about Dylan. When it's some of his best, when he's some of his best stuff in some ways. Yeah, it was the one that I posted on Twitter. That's right. Skyrim has a surprisingly deep Civil War narrative, despite the fact that most of the world is rather shallow. I agree. It's quite subtle in many ways. It doesn't. It never portrays one side or the other as like perfectly good or justified. in it, which I appreciate that. Um, the world, I guess part of the problem with Bethesda games is that the protagonist can basically be whatever they want, which on the one hand is great, but on the other hand, it does mean there's going to be shallowness. Whereas real depth requires like established hierarchy and um, that not everybody can enter. But then you get something like Kingdom Come Deliverance, which goes too far the other way, where it's no fun to play because part of what you want to do is kind of ascend uh, and become great in these video games, and that like it's really difficult to do. You spend most of your time like shoveling and carrying things for people. Maybe that's just a problem with video games in general. Yes, you should. Argus. Argus. Oh, I never played the Hobbit game. I'll need to find it. Go back to all the old ones. I used to play Tomb Raider on PS1. That was good fun. And Spider-Man. Spider-Man on PS1. That was the best Spider-Man. And then Spider-Man 2. It was great because it had all the proper villains in it, like Venom, Doc Ock, Mysterio, and you could swing about. It was linear. It wasn't like the open world ones, but there was a nice charm to it. It felt like it just felt like Spider-Man. Like it just had that atmosphere to it. Even the second one. Uh, yeah, yeah. It's all flashing through my head now. Yeah. Oh yes, yes. Evil mode in the Third Age. That was good. Very good. Um, I'm sorry, AM. I've sent you to despair. Uh, um, yes, Lieutenant Ray. You have a great knowledge of this game. I think you should do the deepest lore on Skyrim. It's going to be great. Um, Riften is the least racist Stormcloak hold. Riften's run by the Mafia. Maybe that's the answer. The Thieves Guild and the Maven Blackbriar. It's exactly what I've been calling for this whole time. The fact that it can be integrated so easily between feudal relationships and the mafia, does that not tell you everything? uh, yeah, that's very true. That's very true. But then, is Ulfric really racist against the Thalmor, or is he a Thalmor plant? Is that Bethesda nodding to the Fed conspiracy of everything? Uh, there's so many ways you could analyze Skyrim. I'm surprised there hasn't been a, a deep dive into it from a political point of view in our circles for a while. Maybe that somebody should do that. Definitely not me. I don't have the knowledge for it, evidently. Uh, I mean, yeah, you're right on that. I mean, the Dragon Ball could be head of virtually everything, apart from being a Jarl or the Emperor, which is kind of silly as well, given the fact that in one of the quests you can actually kill the Emperor. Um, in Skyrim. It's a weird one. It kind of, I guess, the game's so filled with stuff already. It was going to be difficult to include that. But you're right. But that would have required a level of kind of engagement with politics of Skyrim that the game's not built to handle. Like, because then you would realistically want to be able to make decisions, right? About the policies of Skyrim. Then Skyrim slowly like transforms into Crusader Kings 2 at the ascension of the of the Dragonborn. I'd love to see that mod. Um, but this is something I have against a lot of video games actually. Not 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 something like the Lord of the Rings or FIFA because they are very clear in what their wheelhouse is. They just say, okay, we're a fun slasher or we're a fun sports game, and that's what we do. Whereas open world games kind of sell themselves as you can do anything in this world. But realistically, most normie open world games are very limited in what you can actually do, and most of the time it's violence or just clicking the right verbal speech pattern. There's very little you can you can't actually have like a feudal relationship in most video games. You can't decide to cooperate in many open worlds. I know, like even things like Mass Effect, I'm not convinced like the speech dialogue trees are really that deep. I think of something like Grand Theft Auto or Red Dead Redemption. Every solution is just to kill whoever's in front of you. Like that's the easiest path, and that limiting of your frame of action can actually translate into your thought patterns. I'm not saying people then go out and kill people. I mean it darkens your view of the world. It changes the way you interact with it. In various ways. I don't know enough to kind of articulate how, but I do think it changes the way just from my own anecdotal experience, having played certain games. So take something like Grand Theft Auto 5, which is an impressive game and gives you you can do a lot of fun things, but ultimately the only way you can actually interact with the world is through violence, unless you play golf. You play the golf bit, and you get punished for not doing it. And what I mean by that is, so if you go on a rampage, right, the police come and get you, try and get you. If you surrender, you lose money. If you die, you don't lose any money. So you're encouraged not to surrender by the game. So it encourages a certain way of thinking. And I noticed when I played that game, I would swear more in my thinking and even occasionally in my speech. And I wasn't somebody who swore. I stopped playing it and it kind of disappeared over a few days. So I do think games can cultivate certain attitudes, uh, just in the range of ways they can. Yeah, Kingdom Come is fun. It just takes time to get used to. But you have to remember, Trophy, I'm a normie video game player. I want it all served up to me immediately. I want to be the great hero immediately. I'm revealing my modern liberal take that you can be whatever you want to be in video games. Oh dear, this stream is slowly unraveling my own confidence in myself. Shy Tori, there's a story mod called Rigmore which does that, but the Dragonborn kind of becomes a nonce. I cannot comment on that, but disavow. Um, I don't think the issues with Bethesda games is that the protagonist can do anything, rather Bethesda is inept at showing consequences for actions. Yeah, that's fair. I think that's true. I think The Witcher does that a lot better in some respects. Your choices do impact kind of the politics of the world, for example. You can see whether people die or live, and I guess the good example of that is the one with the tree, the evil tree, or the hags and the children. Whatever choice you make, it makes an impact on the village in some way or another. So yeah, I think that's right. But then again, The Witcher doesn't give you the impression you can do whatever you want. Actually, the Witcher, you're not actually the main character really of The Witcher in a weird way, playing Geralt. It's Ciri, right? So she can do whatever she wants, but you're not given that. You've got a much more restricted, albeit expansive, impact on the world and what you can do. So maybe that's something that is important in that respect. Yes, I'd be there for that too. I'd love it. Good idea. And great to see you here, Philippocrit. I enjoyed your stream earlier. I'm sorry I had to bow out a bit early on the Passover. It was really good. It was really good. Everybody should have a look into Lambda Bible studies. They have really good discussions, and what I really appreciate about this channel, which Luke has built, is that you know the way that they engage with the Bible is quite broad but deep and engages a lot of interesting topics, which wouldn't normally come up in a Bible discussion, right? Usually, most folks, when they do Bible study, will pick a passage and go into that in depth. And they do that sometimes on the channel, but it's more like, here's a topic, the Passover. Let's look in depth at various passages which refer to this topic. And that's really interesting, and I learn a lot from it. So, yeah, definitely. Hello, RCW. Good to see you. And I like your picture there. Netflix are erasing all European people for their new Lord of the Rings series. This is an interesting point, and I don't want to get into too much of this. I've been walking a tightrope enough as it is this stream. I guess the one thing I would say on this, and this might not be to everybody's taste on who's watching, but my own personal view is that in some ways the ethnicity of the actors is not the main issue here. The main issue is the purpose or the of what it's in service to, which is a completely, well, I imagine a deconstructed version of the Lord of the Rings, a cynical version, which promotes one's own values over the work of the author. That to me is the biggest affront, because who are they to usurp Tolkien's own understanding of the Silmarillion? In some ways, it's quite apt, because the period they're looking at is about hubris and about the destruction of the world through assuming one can take the place of God in directing things and changing things to fit your own tune. They're so unaware of what the story is actually about. They think they could do this to a story about that. But yes, I think, to me, that's the biggest issue, is that the story is going to be heavily slanted in certain ways, and it's going to be nothing like what Tolkien initially wrote in that respect. But I would add to that I think part of the problem here is not in our circles, but certainly in online, you find lots of channels kind of going off on one about this issue. And they'll talk about things like, oh, they're disrespecting the Tolkien fandom. And, they shouldn't be doing this to the books because it's not part of the lore. Personally, I think these sorts of arguments are incredibly weak, because what that shows to me is that these people are only upset because they enjoy the movies, they enjoy the kind of nerding out on this stuff, but they're not really concerned about the spirit of it. And indeed, they aren't on board with the spirit of kind of the reactionary spirit of the Lord of the Rings. Oftentimes, they're quite just standard uh, liberals or left wingers. When push comes to shove, they'd be quite happy to go back to 90s UK. And in that regard, they're not on the same page. So while I think it raises a lot of issues, and I think we should be careful about thinking that anybody who opposes the series is actually a defender of Tolkien rather than a defender of the noughties Lord of the Rings films, if that makes any sense. That's a whole other discussion, though, isn't it? Yes. That's it. I'm gonna do an elite theory stream in the Elder Scrolls world. That would be epic. That'd be epic. I would enjoy that very much, Shia Tori. It's been good to have you, Byron Brand. Thank you for joining, and have a very good sleep. Yeah, I think that would be interesting. Like you could do it like in a samurai style. That would be cool. But yes. Um, yes, and good night to you, Shayatori. Well, I think that is the last of the comments. So I just want to, before I go, I want to reiterate that on the 12th of February at 7 p.m., there's going to be a live stream discussion here with myself, with Radical Liberation, Gagging for Lit, Lambda Bible Studies, and our very own Apostolic Majesty. And we're going to be discussing That Hideous Strength. You can find it on Z Library. You can get copies easily. It's a really great book. So make sure you come along for that. It'll be good fun. We've had one last chat. Everybody's life would instantly improve if they cancel their streaming service memberships. Yes. Perhaps. Yeah, I think you're right on that. I would need to think a bit about it. We're not going to have it in Mafia Land anyway, so we can look forward to freedom from it then. Thank you, everybody who's tuned in and watched and contributed to the chat, and to all those lurkers as well who are just watching. I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate that you're taking your time out on a Friday evening to watch. It does mean a lot, and I look forward to seeing what you guys say in the comments. Feel free to put your ideas there and challenge anything I say or build upon it. And yeah, I want to wish you all a very good night, a fabulous weekend, one filled with goodness and mercy. Cheerio.